In this lecture, we're going to talk about Cubism. So far, we have been moving towards more and more abstraction. We've seen, for example, the Fauves that abstracted by color. So they still looked to the natural world, but they abstracted color and then those sort of broad bands of complementary color. And then those German expressionists, I'm specifically thinking of the Blue Rider, they moved away from any recognizable elements from the natural world. They moved away from mimesis, or sort of mimicking the natural world. They were going for pure emotion. And so we sort of saw these sort of studies in line and color, and we said they're very expressive works. They have a strong sort of emotional content, and that's how they abstracted the image. Some of these, like the German expressionists, had a very strong sort of move towards abstraction, not looking at all to the natural world and just going internally into the artist's own imagination. Others are a little weaker, like the Fauves. They're still looking at the natural world. They're still engaged with nature, but they abstracted it in one particular way, and in that way was sort of color and maybe some brushstroke. But the Cubists, I would say, would put in that same category as the Fauves, because when you look at a Cubist work, you still recognize it as being rooted in the natural world, but there are some elements that are changed here. And we can see the very beginning sort of feelers set out by Cezanne that you see here on the left-hand side. It was said that Cezanne, quote, cracked the glass, but Picasso shattered it. So Cezanne, even though he's not considered a Cubist, is a good place to start. Cezanne became interested in reducing the image to its basic shapes. He advised painters to study nature in terms of, quote, the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. When you look at a Cubist work, and we see, again, just the feelers here with Cezanne, here's what you are looking for. You're looking for an image that is not terribly realistic, but is still coherent. So a Cubist work applies structure to a natural form. And so the image is then sort of distilled down or reduced to basic shapes, like the cone and the rectangle and the prism. So the picture plane is flattened and it's fractured, and it's reduced down to these sort of basic component shapes. So again, you can see how this is moving towards abstraction, but in a very different way. If you look at the color here, the color is not like a Fauvist color. You can see how the Fauves really had the corner on the market there when it came to color. When you look at a Cubist work, the color is not altogether all of that interesting, and neither is the subject matter. Their subject matter are oftentimes things like still lives, fruits, musical instrument, women, townscapes and landscapes, and their color is not, as I said, altogether notable. But what they're known for is fracturing up that image, breaking it down to its sort of basic and component shapes. The name Cubism sticks in the year 1911, and like many of the different movements that we've studied, it came from a critic. He said that these were cubic eccentricities, and that's where the name Cubism comes from. Let's look at the work of Picasso here on the right-hand side. A very famous painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907. Picasso, and then later we'll see the work of Braque, furthered the innovation started by Cezanne, reducing the image to its central formal elements and collapsing space. When we look at this work, we can see that many of them are very, the images aren't created all sort of equally in terms of how sort of broken down they are. The two right figures are probably the most sort of cubic. We can see the artist's interest in African masks. The subject matter are prostitutes on Avignon Street, and it shows this cubic reduction and distortion with the intention of evoking this sort of reality of the disease-ridden, horrible existence of the prostitute. So you can certainly see how this abstraction, fracturing it and breaking it down, really does add to its content, sort of its meaning. You do sort of get this horrible existence of what it would be like to have to be a prostitute. The bottom right figure has its back to us. This is probably the most sort of jarring. You can see we're looking at the back of the figure, but there's an impossibly twisted head that turns around, and this chin is resting on this sort of claw-like hand that comes out toward us. So all of it is very sort of disturbing in that sense. The central figures have distorted faces and bodies, and they're all sort of gyrating around, attempting to market themselves. This certainly shows us the realities, or Picasso sees the realities of modern city life. Let's move on the left-hand side to Brock. Actually, that moved one too many. We move back one. This is called Houses, and it's by Brock from the year 1908. As you can see, the houses and the trees are reduced to, again, their essential shape and line and color. The houses are reduced to a cube with a prism on top. Space is, because of that reduction, collapsed and distorted. We're almost back to that sort of ladder perspective where up equals back. The houses are stacked. We do get a tree in the foreground that provides a little bit of overlap for us. One thing I want you to note is that oftentimes in Cubist work, you're looking at several views sort of simultaneously. Because of that, the image tends to be sort of lively and kind of keeps the eye moving. So if we look, for example, at this house here, you can see that there's a light source coming from this side, but there's also a light source coming from this side. So the light is sort of indiscriminate. And because of that, because we have these sort of splashes of light all over the work, these Cubist work oftentimes sort of keep the eye moving. So even though it's sort of flat, it doesn't mean that it's sort of a boring work. It kind of keeps your eye moving in and around the work with that sort of splash of light that is sort of haphazard around the work. Here's another work by Brock coming up on the left-hand side. It's called Violin and Palette, 1909. Shows us again a further reduction of space. We're looking at a three-dimensional world in two-dimensional terms. So we take this sort of three-dimensional world and we sort of fracture it and flatten it and push it close to the eye of the viewer. So a flattening of that picture plane. It's sort of interesting to note here at the top, there's this ambiguous sort of nail. It either looks like it's holding up this palette or perhaps holding up the entire painting. It's a nice sort of trompe l'oeil effect, or sort of furthering the eye, or fooling the eye, I should say. The works that we've seen so far by these cubists are what's called analytic cubism, and these are works that are painted. Analytic cubists are painted works. But another form of cubism is called synthetic cubism, and synthetic cubism can be seen here by Brock here on the left-hand side. Synthetic cubism fractures the work and flattens the work by starting with bits and scraps of paper. So we have plain paper here and printed paper that gives you these sort of bottles that are on this table. It says Vin there, and then this is sort of the outline of the table that goes around here. So it's sort of a mixed medium that we have the charcoal and also the paper, but a synthetic cubist work uses bits and scraps of paper as a way of sort of naturally fracturing and flattening the work.